If you're that clever, prove it. 12 professionals walked out. The overnight cleaner stayed and stunned the room. Vivienne Cole was guiding her supply trolley along the polished granite hallway of Harrington Tower in the heart of Manhattan. Her navy work uniform was creased at the elbows, her rubber-soled shoes worn smooth at the heel, her roughened palms wrapped around a damp mop handle. When the shouting reached her from the executive boardroom at the end of the top-floor corridor, it was nearly midnight. The lights behind those heavy mahogany doors were still blazing, and that, in Vivienne's experience, meant one thing: trouble. 12 interpreters had been dismissed that evening, one after another, each unable to produce an accurate translation of the contract documents that stood between Harrington Enterprises and a $200 million agreement with one of the most influential Japanese investment groups on the Pacific Rim. That was when Victor Crane, the man who ran the most formidable private syndicate on the entire East Coast, a man whose name alone could drain the color from the faces of people who had never met him, drove his fist into the boardroom table and fixed his gaze on the trembling interpreter who had just stepped through the door. "If you're so extraordinarily gifted," he said, each word landing like a separate blow, "then translate this contract correctly, because Mitsuru is 30 seconds away from disconnecting that call. And if he does, I assure you, you will not be the only person in this building who vanishes tonight." Vivienne stopped pushing the trolley. Through the narrow gap where the boardroom door had not quite closed, she could see them all. The senior executives in their tailored suits clustered around the conference table. Marcus Webb pressing both palms against his temples. Elaine Torrance scribbling hard on a yellow legal pad, jaw set tight. Gerald Ashby leaning back with arms folded across his chest, wearing the expression of a man who considered every setback someone else's incompetence. And on the vast display mounted to the far wall, Mitsuru Kenji, the elderly Japanese investor, seated motionless in what appeared to be a private office in Tokyo, his composed expression shifting slowly, almost imperceptibly, from patience into something that looked a great deal like farewell. She recognized that look. She had seen it before, on the faces of doctors in hospital corridors, on the faces of bank managers reviewing loan applications, on the faces of every person who had already made up their mind, but hadn't yet said so aloud. "Kikan J. Taida," she whispered, and didn't realize she had spoken until the words were already in the air. The Japanese phrase slipped from her lips like something that had been locked away for 6 years and found a crack to escape through. The room fell absolutely silent. Every head turned toward the doorway, where Vivienne Cole stood, frozen, still gripping the mop handle with both hands, a spray bottle tucked under her arm. Her slight frame barely filled the gap in the door. Dark hair tucked under her work cap. Those gray-green eyes, the ones that had spent 6 years looking at this building, without the building ever looking back, were now fixed on the contract document displayed on the secondary monitor positioned near the entrance. Victor Crane turned his head slowly, and for the first time in 6 years of walking past her in these corridors without acknowledgement, he looked at her. Not through her. At her. Victor Crane did not raise his voice. He never needed to. He simply directed his gaze toward the doorway and spoke 2 words in a tone so quiet it cut through the room like a blade through still water. "Bring her in." The 2 black-suited security personnel positioned on either side of the door stepped back, and Vivienne Cole, mop still in her left hand, spray bottle still in her right, crossed the threshold of the Harrington boardroom for the first time in 6 years, not to clean it, but to enter it. Her rubber soles made almost no sound against the polished black marble floor. But in that absolute silence, each step registered like a drumbeat. Gerald Ashby broke it first. He shifted back in his leather chair, folded both arms across his chest, let his gaze travel slowly from Vivienne's work cap to her worn shoes, and then laughed. Not quietly, not under his breath. He laughed the way men laugh when they believe no one in the room will correct them. "Is this someone's idea of humor?" he said. "A cleaning operative." The words pressed down on Vivienne's shoulders like something physical. She had spent 6 years being looked through. Being looked down upon was a different thing entirely, and she had learned long ago that contempt only landed if she invited it to. Elaine Torrance set her pen on the table and turned to face Gerald with a look so cool and precise it made his laughter stop mid-breath. "Let her speak," Elaine said. Calm, absolute, and in that moment Vivienne understood why. In 6 years inside this building, out of every person on every floor, Elaine Torrance had been the only one who reliably looked her in the eye when she said good evening. Every single time. On the main display, Mitsuru Kenji leaned forward slightly. His sharp, careful eyes narrowed, the expression of a man appraising something that had just surprised him. He spoke in Japanese. Measured. Deliberate. Do you understand this language? Vivienne rested the mop against the wall beside the door. She set the spray bottle on the floor. Then she walked to the conference table, where a contract of more than 50 pages lay open amid cold coffee cups and expensive ballpoint pens, and picked it up. Her calloused fingers moved through the pages at a speed nobody in the room had anticipated. "Hi, wakarimasu," she answered Mitsuru, in Japanese so precise and natural that Marcus Webb lifted his head from his hands and stared at her as though he were seeing a stranger who had somehow been standing in his office for years. Vivienne paused at page 17, then page 32, then page 49. Each time she stopped, the atmosphere in the room grew heavier. "Here," she said, placing one finger on the first clause. The translated version states that Harrington Enterprises will provide construction materials for 5 development projects. Mr. Mitsuru's original Japanese text clearly specifies 50 projects. That is not a translation nuance. That is a discrepancy worth more than $80 million. Marcus Webb went pale so quickly it was almost audible. Gerald Ashby uncrossed his arms. Elaine Torrance began writing at speed. "Here." Vivienne turned to page 32. The interpreter translated the delivery deadline as a commencement deadline. "Your team believes you have 18 months to break ground. In reality, Mr. Mitsuru's contract requires all construction to be completed within 18 months. The distinction between beginning work and finishing it is not minor. If you sign the translated version as it stands, you will be in breach from the first working day." Marcus Webb pushed to his feet as though something had knocked him upward. "That cannot be right," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "And here." Vivienne turned to page 49, her voice as even as if she were reading a duty roster while the room unraveled around her. "The liability clause. The translation restricts insurance coverage to on-site workplace incidents. The original Japanese extends it to include environmental damage. If a pollution event occurs at the coastal bay development, and given the scale of this port and entertainment complex, the probability is not negligible. Harrington Enterprises bears the full financial exposure. No ceiling, no limitation. At the figures involved in this project, that exposure could reach 9 figures. What followed was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of a room waiting to discover whether the damage was survivable. On the screen, Mitsuru Kenji nodded. Slowly. Deliberately. And for the first time that evening, he smiled just slightly just at the corners of his mouth. But it was enough. Every person in the boardroom understood what that small movement meant. The woman with the mop had been correct. About everything. Victor Crane had not spoken since ordering her brought in. He stood at the head of the table, both hands braced against the surface, his dark eyes fixed on Vivienne without interruption. She felt the weight of that attention the way one feels pressure change before a storm, present, undeniable, and impossible to ignore. She understood that in Victor Crane's world, his attention was not a reward. It was a test. And those who failed it rarely received another. He spoke one sentence, but the deliberate, unhurried way he delivered it, each word placed carefully, like something being loaded rather than said, made the entire room hold its breath. "Who are you?" Vivienne did not answer immediately. She looked down at her hands, at the skin roughened by cleaning solvents, at the knuckles cracked from cold water in the early hours of countless mornings. Then she looked up and met the gaze of Victor Crane, the man who had just asked who she was, in a room where that question had never before been necessary, and she understood with complete clarity that this moment was irreversible. Either she returned to pushing her trolley through marble corridors as though this night had never happened, or she told the truth and surrendered the invisibility she had spent 6 years relying on. "I'm the one who listened," Vivienne said. Her voice was quiet, steady, like a wire drawn taut, flexible enough not to snap, strong enough not to bend. "For 6 years I've cleaned these rooms. For 6 years I've been present while you conducted business, negotiated, argued, celebrated, threatened. I heard Mr. Webb call the bank at midnight. I heard Ms. Torrance reviewing contract language aloud in her office when she thought she was alone. I heard Mr. Ashby discussing his colleagues in the staff kitchen when he believed only the coffee machine was paying attention." Gerald Ashby's face colored sharply. He said nothing. Elaine Torrance lifted her eyes from her notepad and studied Vivienne with an expression that wasn't quite sympathy and wasn't quite surprise, but carried something of both. "Listening doesn't account for fluent Japanese," Marcus Webb said. He was still standing, still pale. "Where did you learn it? Who were you before you came here?" Vivienne drew a slow breath. She looked briefly at Elaine, the only person in this room who had ever seen her before tonight, and Elaine gave the smallest nod. A single, almost invisible gesture of permission. It was enough. "I graduated from Columbia University," Vivienne said. The sentence entered the room like a stone dropped into perfectly still water. "Applied linguistics. I speak 8 languages: Japanese, English, Spanish, French, Italian, German, Mandarin, and Russian." She paused to let that settle. "Before my final graduate year, I also completed coursework at the Colburn School of Business. 2 years finance concentration. I didn't finish the program, but I learned enough to recognize that the 3 errors I just identified are not simply translation failures. They are structural financial errors that, left uncorrected, would have dismantled this agreement from its foundation." Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. A boardroom worth more than most people would earn in a lifetime. Dark hardwood, crystal lighting, Manhattan through floor, took ceiling glass, had just been rearranged by a thin woman in a Navy work uniform. And the most unsettling thing was not what she was saying. It was the slow, accumulating realization that every person in that room had walked past her every single evening for 6 years and had never once thought to ask a single question. On the display, Mitsuru Kenji spoke in English, precise and unhurried, the cadence of a man who believed that each word deserved its full weight. "Miss Cole," he said, and the respect in his voice had not been there a minute ago. "I would like to ask you to review this contract in its entirety. I believe there are additional errors that the 12 individuals before you failed to identify, or chose not to." He said that final phrase quietly, but every person in the room caught it. And Vivienne understood, looking at the elderly investor's expression, that Mitsuru Kenji had not survived 60 years of international business by believing that 12 consecutive failures were a matter of coincidence. Victor Crane had not moved from the head of the table. His hands were still on the surface. His eyes had not left Vivienne, and in those dark, unreadable eyes, she saw something new, something different from the assessment of 5 minutes ago, different from the acknowledgement of 2 minutes ago. What she saw now was the look of a man who had just understood that the most dangerous intelligence in his building was not behind a locked door or standing in his security detail. It had been pushing a cleaning trolley through his corridors for 6 years, and he had not yet decided whether that was the greatest stroke of fortune or the most serious vulnerability of his career. The moment Michiru finished speaking, Victor Crane released his grip on the tabletop and straightened to his full height. The room seemed to contract slightly, the way rooms do when a person who commands space decides to use all of it. 12 interpreters, he said. Slow, each word its own sentence. 12 people, compensated generously, and not one correct translation. Does that seem like coincidence to you? Vivienne did not answer immediately. She set the contract on the table and reached into the side pocket of her work uniform, the kind of pocket most people would assume contained a cloth or a pair of rubber gloves, and withdrew an old mobile phone. A basic handset, the type now found only in pawn shops and bottom drawers. Its screen scratched from every direction. One corner of the casing cracked and held together with a strip of clear tape. The first three were genuinely unqualified, she said, her voice carrying that same unsettling calm. Legal Japanese and commercial Japanese are distinct disciplines, and this contract requires both simultaneously, particularly with port construction and hospitality licensing terminology. Not every interpreter can handle that combination. She paused. Her gaze moved around the table. Gerald Ashby rigid, Marcus Webb gripping the back of his chair, Elaine Torrance holding her pen perfectly still above her notepad. The remaining 9 translated incorrectly because they intended to. Gerald Ashby moved first. He pushed upright, his face ashen. "You are accusing credentialed professionals hired by this company's own budget." "I'm not accusing anyone," Vivian said. She opened the phone, pressed several buttons, and stopped on an audio file. 8 days ago, while I was cleaning the staff lounge on floor 46, the 8th interpreter was seated on the sofa making a phone call. He didn't see me. I was kneeling behind the glass supply cart. She let the silence sit for 1 beat. Even if he had seen me, he wouldn't have adjusted. Because I was just the cleaner. She pressed play. A man's voice emerged from the small speaker, distorted by distance and the age of the recording, but entirely clear. "Relax. I'll translate the liability section again. They'll have to keep calling us back. Every delay inflates our consulting rates. They're drowning. Let them sink a little further. Then we pull them out at whatever number we decide." Marcus Webb released the chair back. His knuckles were white. Elaine Torrance set her pen on the table and did not pick it up again. "And this," Vivienne said, scrolling to a second file, "was recorded 48 hours ago. A different voice, the 11th interpreter. He placed this call from the underground car park on level 2 of this building at 11 o'clock at night, shortly after he was dismissed." The second voice came through lower, more assured, and considerably more cold. "Harrington is desperate. They'll accept any figure we name at this point. Let 1 or 2 more failed attempts go through, and they'll sign anything we put in front of them. The director says tonight's number 12 is ours, so don't worry about it." Vivienne closed the phone. The final 3 words, "tonight's number 12 is ours," hung in the air the way gunpowder lingers after the shot, not seen, but unmistakably there. Gerald Ashby lowered himself back into his chair, as though something had gone out of him. Marcus Webb turned to Victor Crane. His voice, when it came, had lost its boardroom authority entirely. "This is coordinated. These aren't freelancers acting on personal greed. Someone is directing this." Victor Crane had not looked at anyone but Vivienne since the moment the recordings ended. He stood still, the faint scar along the left side of his neck shifting slightly, the only visible sign that beneath his composure something was turning. When he spoke, his voice was so quiet it was more frightening than anything louder would have been. "How long have you known?" "Approximately 10 days. Vivienne replied. "I wanted to be certain before I said anything. 10 days. Victor repeated the phrase slowly, as though pressing it for weight. "Why didn't you come forward earlier?" Vivienne held his gaze. She did not blink. She did not step back. She did not lower her head. "Because who would have listened to me?" she said. A night shift cleaning operative holding a mop, telling the most powerful private organization on the East Coast that its entire team of professional interpreters had been systematically sabotaged. Who in this room? Mr. Crane, who specifically, would have believed me? The silence that followed lasted longer than any answer could have, because every person in that boardroom understood that she was right, and understanding it left no one willing to speak. Victor Crane picked up the landline on the table, pressed a single button, and spoke to the person on the other end in a voice Vivienne recognized instantly. Not the voice of the chief executive of Harrington Enterprises. The other voice, the one she had heard in 6 years of late-night corridors, low, flat, and absolutely without heat, which made it, somehow worse than anger, trace the interpreter network to its source. "I want the full chain of names within 48 hours. He replaced the receiver, looked at Vivienne, And in his eyes, she saw something she had not seen before. Not the assessment of an employer, not the acknowledgement of a businessman. She saw the expression of a man who had just discovered that his empire had been attacked from an angle his entire apparatus had failed to detect. And the only person who had seen it coming was standing in front of him in a Navy work uniform with worn rubber soles. He was not yet certain whether that made her the most valuable person in the building or the most dangerous. As soon as Mitsuru's request had been acknowledged by the room, Victor straightened fully and turned to the screen. "Mr. Mitsuru, how long can you remain available?" "Until 3 in the morning New York time," Mitsuru replied without hesitation. "Then, with one condition. I will accept a translation prepared only by Miss Cole. No substitutions." "Agreed," Victor said immediately. He turned to Vivienne. "What do you need?" And here Vivienne Cole did something that no one in the room, not even Elaine Torrance, who had begun to understand that this woman was unlike anyone she had previously met, had anticipated. Rather than express gratitude, rather than defer, rather than show any of the usual relief of someone being offered an opportunity they'd been denied for years, Vivienne Ashford set her conditions. "First," she said, her tone unchanged, the same quiet steadiness she'd maintained since the moment she entered the room. "A workstation connected to the Harrington internal document system. Second, access to all existing project files relating to port construction and real estate development. I'll need to cross-reference technical terminology to ensure absolute accuracy. Third, when I finish the translation, I want a private conversation with you." Gerald Ashby made a sound in his throat, somewhere between a short laugh and something he thought better of. "The cleaner is negotiating with the director," he said, but his voice had thinned considerably since his first comment. It carried none of the same confidence. Victor Crane did not look at Gerald. He looked at Vivienne, and after a silence that lasted approximately 4 seconds, during which the entire room appeared to forget how to breathe, he said one word: "Agreed." Elaine Torrance stood immediately. "Vivienne, you can work from my office. I'll walk you up and show you how to access the—" "That won't be necessary," Vivienne said. Elaine stopped mid-sentence. "I already know how to use the system." Vivienne continued. "I've watched you log in, open files, and navigate the document archive for 6 years. While I cleaned your keyboard." Elaine Torrance studied Vivienne for a long moment. Then, very slowly, something crossed her face that wasn't quite a smile, but was closer to one than Vivienne had ever seen from Steele Holdings' chief legal counsel. The two women left the boardroom together, one in a fitted charcoal blazer, one in a Navy cleaning uniform. Their footsteps on the marble corridor just before 1 in the morning sounded, to anyone listening, exactly the same. 3 hours later, just before 4 in the morning, Vivienne returned to the boardroom, carrying a stack of neatly ordered pages. Her eyes were red at the edges from sustained focus and the hour. Her back was straight. When she placed the completed translation on the conference table, her hands were perfectly still. Mitsuru Kenji had reappeared on the screen, this time flanked by 2 assistants. All 3 wore reading glasses, and each held a printed copy of the original Japanese contract. Over the following 22 minutes, they read, compared, deliberated, speaking quickly in Japanese, pointing to clauses, confirming figures, checking appendices. Vivienne sat at the far end of the table and said nothing. She understood every word they exchanged. But she also understood that silence, at the right moment, carried more authority than any explanation. Finally, Mitsuru removed his reading glasses. He looked at the camera directly, and when he smiled, it was not the small, careful expression of cautious approval. It was broader, warmer, the smile of someone who had been searching for something for a very long time and had finally, unexpectedly, found it. "Perfect," he said in English. "Not a single error. This is precisely what was agreed. Miss Cole, your translation is not merely accurate. It is clearer than the document our own legal team originally produced." A collective exhale moved through the boardroom like weather, sudden, physical, and difficult to describe to anyone who hadn't been in the room for the preceding 3 hours. Marcus Webb leaned back in his chair, closed his eyes, and placed both hands over his face. The posture of a man who has just survived something and hasn't yet processed that it's over. Gerald Ashby sat motionless, studying the table. Victor Crane stood. "Then we have a deal. We have a deal," Mitsuru confirmed. Then he paused, and the single word that followed landed with the quiet weight of something heavy set down very carefully. However, every heart in the boardroom paused. "I have one requirement," Mitsuru said. "All communication between my organization and Harrington Enterprises, all documents, all correspondence, all meetings, must pass through Miss Cole going forward. She is the only person in this room I trust." He looked directly at Vivienne through the camera. "This project is worth $200 million and represents a commitment of several years. At that scale, reliability is not optional. And tonight, the only reliable presence in this room was the one nobody thought to notice for 6 years." Victor Crane turned to Vivienne. His eyes asked the question without his mouth opening. Vivienne looked back at him. And in that moment, beneath the boardroom lighting at 4 in the morning, surrounded by the faint smell of cold coffee and paperwork and the trace of cleaning solvent still clinging to her uniform, she understood that the door she was looking at had opened, and she could not any longer pretend to be invisible. After Miss Choru's screen went dark, after Marcus Webb gathered his papers with hands that still weren't quite steady, after Elaine Torrance placed a brief hand on Vivienne's shoulder before walking out, after Gerald Ashby left the room without making eye contact with anyone, Victor Crane buttoned the lower button of his jacket with the deliberate calm of a man who had just won a war and was not in the habit of showing it. And then he spoke to Vivienne in a voice she had never heard him use. In 6 years, not commanding, not distant, not the voice of someone who summoned people to him, the voice of someone extending an invitation. He told her she had asked for a private conversation. He told her to follow him. He guided her along the top-floor corridor, through the bulletproof glass security doors, into a section of the building Vivienne had never been permitted to access. Victor Crane maintained his own private maintenance team for these floors. Into his personal office. The room was 3 times the size of the studio apartment she rented in the Bronx. Dark walnut paneling. A broad mahogany desk positioned before floor-to-ceiling glass that looked out over Manhattan at nearly 5 in the morning, the city still glowing below like a tapestry made entirely from light. In one corner, a glass display unit held not books but a row of locked document cases, each marked with a symbol Vivienne was wise enough not to inquire about. He gestured toward the black leather chair in front of the desk and told her to sit. Vivienne sat, still in her cleaning uniform, still carrying the faint chemical scent on her skin. She noticed that she had forgotten to remove the cleaning cloth she'd tucked into her rear pocket, its corner still visible. A small, precise reminder of who she had been for 6 years, and still was until this moment. Victor did not take the seat behind the desk. He pulled out the second chair and sat directly across from her, no desk between them. And that proximity, closer than she had ever seen him sit with anyone, told her that this man did not want answers from a professional distance. He wanted to see the truth in her face as she gave them. He asked one word. Why? It was not a question with a rising intonation. It was a question with the weight of everything behind it. Why someone who had graduated from Columbia, who spoke 8 languages, who had studied finance and commerce, would spend 6 years pushing a supply trolley through a building like this one, at midnight, wearing a uniform that made her disappear. Vivienne looked down at her hands. This time she did not look up immediately, because the answer she was about to give was not one she had spoken aloud in full, not to anyone, in 6 years. And even after all this time, the first breath of it still caught in the same place it always had. She said it was her younger brother. His name was Noah. When he was 15, doctors found a tumor in his brain. She stopped, swallowed, continued. Their parents had been killed in a road accident when Vivienne was 21. She had been Noah's sole legal guardian since that afternoon. His sister, his provider, the only constant in his life when everything else had collapsed. The surgery had been experimental. The only option with any reasonable probability of saving him, not covered by insurance. The total cost over 3 years had come close to $400,000. She said the figure simply, the way one reads a line from a document. But Victor Crane, who had grown up in rooms where numbers of that size were spoken without any weight at all, understood that behind this particular number were 3 years of a young woman in her mid-20s sleeping no more than 4 hours a night, selling the small flat her parents had left, selling the car, borrowing from banks until the banks stopped returning calls, borrowing from friends until the friendships caved under the weight, borrowing eventually from people in parts of the Bronx she should never have been near, because there was nothing left to sell, no one left to approach, and the only things she still possessed were her hands and the hours between 11 at night and 7 in the morning that no one else wanted. Human Resources had processed her application for the night cleaning shift without a second look. 11 at night to 7 in the morning. Sleep 2 hours. Take No to the treatment center. Sit beside his bed during the infusions. Return home, sleep 2 more hours. Collect him when he was discharged. Work through the coursework with him. Cook. Watch him sleep. Go back to work. She told the whole of it without tears, and that was what made it worse than any amount of crying would have. Because it showed she had told it to herself so many times, in the early hours of empty corridors, in the elevator, in the staff bathroom before starting her shift, that the grief had worn smooth. Only the facts remained clean. Bone white. Victor asked how No was now. It was Vivienne noticed, the first question he had asked, not to assess or evaluate, but because he wanted to know. Her face changed, the smile that appeared slow, unguarded, reaching the corners of her green eyes in a way that made her look entirely unlike the woman who had stood in his boardroom 2 hours ago, was the first smile Victor Crane had ever seen on her face, and it transformed her in a way he found, entirely without his permission, difficult to look away from. She said he was well, healthy, in full remission. As one of the strongest students in his accelerated program, he had skipped 2 academic years. He was now in his final semester at New York University, completing a medical degree. He intended to specialize in pediatric oncology, so that he could care for children experiencing what he had experienced. Victor said she must be proud of him. Not as a question. She said it had been worth every day, every pair of worn-through shoes, every hour of no sleep, every callus on her hands. Victor was quiet for a long time. Then he asked the question Vivienne had known from the moment she began speaking was coming. The one she feared most. Did Noah know what she had done? About all of it. Her voice changed, hardened, the way something hardens not from coldness but from intention. No, she said. He believes I held an administrative position. He has believed that for 6 years. And he will continue to believe it, for as long as I am able to make that true. Victor said nothing more. He turned toward the glass, looking out at Manhattan as it moved from the deepest part of the night toward the uncertain gray of early morning. The skyline was edged with the faintest orange along the eastern horizon, and his hand moved, almost without his seeming to be aware of it, to the left breast pocket of his jacket, to a silver pocket watch he never opened in front of other people. Vivienne didn't know what it was. She didn't know it had belonged to a woman named Margaret, who had played Chopin in a small apartment in Brooklyn Heights before life carried her somewhere she hadn't chosen to go and never allowed her to return. But she saw Victor Crane's fingers, the fingers that had signed arrangements making the entire East Coast rearrange itself, moving across the surface of that watch with a tenderness she had not, until this moment, believed him capable of. And in that stillness, in that early morning light beginning to fill the room from below, she glimpsed someone else. Not the director, not the chief executive, not the name that emptied rooms, a son, still missing his mother. The daylight had reached the lower third of the window when Victor withdrew his hand from the pocket watch, straightened in his chair, and when his face shifted from that rare, unguarded moment back to its usual precise clarity, it happened so quickly that Vivienne almost doubted she had seen anything, but she had seen it, and things seen cannot be unseen. Mitsuru's proposal stands, Victor said. His voice had returned to its measured, organizational cadence. He wants you as the sole communications liaison between our two organizations. The Coastal Bay development is a minimum 3-year project, with strong probability of extension. You would work directly under my oversight as Special Liaison Director, with compensation reflecting what you demonstrated tonight. He named a figure. Vivienne heard it. It took her a moment to process, because the number was larger than her total income across 6 years of night shifts combined. And she had an almost irresistible urge to laugh at the mathematics of it. That the same hands, the same mind, the same person could be worth $14 an hour with a mop, and several hundred times that amount in a chair. Before I answer, she said. Victor's eyebrow lifted by a fraction. He was not accustomed to offers remaining open after he had made them. More conditions, he said. His tone was not irritated. It was something closer to the way a chess player responds when their opponent produces a move they hadn't charted. First, Vivienne said, I want to continue cleaning, a few hours each week. Victor Crane looked at her the way people look at someone who has just said something in a language they don't speak. You've just been offered a position that requires a graduate degree and a decade of specialized experience to qualify for, and you want to continue mopping floors. Because that's where people stop being careful. Vivienne replied. No one guards their words around a cleaner. No one maintains their professional persona in front of someone they consider invisible. For 6 years, I have known more about the real operations of this building than any camera or monitoring system. If you want me to be genuinely useful to you, Mr. Crane, then let me keep my presence in the places where people say what they actually mean. Victor went quiet. Not the silence of objection. The silence of someone calculating. And when Victor Crane calculated, Vivienne had learned, it meant you had said something he found valuable. She continued, is more important. Go on. I am not the only one, Vivienne said. Her voice had shifted. It was no longer the voice of someone negotiating for herself. It was the voice of someone who had been carrying something for a long time and had decided, now, to set it down in front of another person. In this building, right now, there are at least 15 people performing roles that have nothing to do with what they are actually capable of. And no one has asked why. Victor's expression sharpened slightly. Give me an example. Claudette, in the basement kitchen, the woman Miss Ashby refers to as the old cook. Vivienne's voice remained even, though her eyes didn't. She was the head chef at Meridian, a Michelin-listed restaurant in the West Village. She left because her marriage had become dangerous. She needed to disappear. A night kitchen role in a building where nobody looked too closely at her background was the safest option she had. And she took it. Victor said nothing. Vivienne continued. Roland in the records and logistics department, 64 years old. The man your operations team refers to as the old filing guy. He was chief accountant at a mid-size investment firm in Midtown for 22 years before redundancy at 60 made him effectively unemployable. Not because his abilities had declined, but because firms didn't want to pay experienced salaries for roles they could fill cheaper. He can reconstruct a balance sheet from raw data faster than anyone working on floor 47. She paused. And Naomi, the overnight reception desk. Most people in this building don't know her surname. She has a degree in architectural design from Pratt Institute. When her husband had a stroke 18 months ago, she needed a role with predictable hours and minimal commute time so she could work and be home for his care. The night desk was the only thing she could find that made that possible. The office was quiet. The morning light had spread across the center of the floor, cutting the room diagonally, half in shadow, half in pale gold. Vivienne sat precisely on that line, as she had, she thought, for most of her adult life, on the boundary between seen and not seen. I want a program, she said. Not charitable provision. Not symbolic gestures. A genuine, structured process of discovery, finding the people in this building whose abilities are being wasted, and creating conditions in which they can use them. Not as a favor, as a resource. Because every one of them is a resource, and right now they're being used at a fraction of their value. Victor rose from his chair, walked to the glass, stood looking out at Manhattan below, where the city was beginning, slowly, imperfectly, with the particular energy of a place that never entirely stops, to wake up for another day. He stood there long enough that Vivienne thought he might refuse. Then he turned back. "You saved a $200 million deal tonight," he said. The words were slow, individually weighted. "You exposed a coordinated sabotage operation that my entire security infrastructure failed to detect. You translated a contract that 12 trained professionals could not handle. And when I ask what you want in return, you ask for a kitchen supervisor, an older logistics clerk, and the person at the overnight reception desk." He paused, looking at her, and in those dark eyes, Vivienne saw something she could not quite name, but that made her hold very still. "Why?" Vivienne stood. For the first time in the conversation, she smiled, not the bright, unguarded smile she had worn when speaking about Noah. The quieter smile of someone who has walked far enough through darkness to know what they actually need and what they don't. "Because my brother is alive," she said. "He is healthy. He is going to be a doctor. I have everything I need, Mr. Crane. But the people I just described to you are still waiting, and I know what that feels like." 3 days after that night, Vivienne Cole left Harrington Tower at 4 in the morning as usual. But she was not leaving a cleaning shift. She had just completed her first full working session as Special Liaison Director. In the office on the 45th floor that Elaine Torrance had arranged within 24 hours of the boardroom meeting, a compact room at the end of the eastern corridor that had previously been used for archival storage and had been emptied in a single afternoon at Elaine's precise instruction. Vivienne had reviewed the full Mitsuru contract appendix one final time before transmitting it to Tokyo. She was tired in the particular way that comes from sustained concentration rather than physical exhaustion, her green eyes reading everything through a thin gauze of fatigue. She walked to the Fulton Street subway entrance in the same direction she always had, 3 connecting lines to the Bronx. 40 minutes on a good night. When she turned into the service alley between Cortlandt Avenue and Morrison Street, a shortcut she had used for 6 years because it saved 9 minutes, she felt, before she saw, that something was wrong. 2 men. End of the alley. Backs against the brick, hands buried in jacket pockets. Standing in the particular way of people who are not there by coincidence. She checked behind her, a 3rd man already at the alley entrance, blocking the exit. 6 years of walking home at midnight through lower Manhattan, and the Bronx had trained her body to read situations before her mind caught up. This one said, "You are not getting out of here the same way you came in." The taller of the 2 men moved forward. His face was positioned beneath the low brim of a cap. He extended a brown envelope without speaking. Vivienne took it. Her hand did not shake. She would think about that later, whether it was courage or simply the absence of expectation that anyone would come. She opened it. 3 photographs. The first, Noah, walking out of the NYU medical building, backpack across one shoulder, earphones around his neck, smiling at something only he could hear. Taken from across the street with a telephoto lens. The second, Noah in a coffee shop on the corner of Bleecker Street, bent over a textbook, a drink he hadn't touched in front of him. The reflection of the photographer just visible in the glass of the window behind him. The third made the air leave Vivienne's lungs in a single, sudden movement, as though something had struck her from behind. The front door of her Bronx studio, photographed at night from close range, and on the reverse side, written in red ink, the message, "The Mitsuru contract does not get signed. Your brother's eyes look very much like yours. It would be a shame if those eyes stopped seeing things." The taller man withdrew his hand from his jacket pocket. Vivienne caught the edge of metal at his waistband, the handle of a firearm, exposed just enough for her to see, not enough to constitute a visible threat. A calibrated exposure, the gesture of someone who had done this before and knew exactly how much to show. He said it was a message, that she was intelligent, and she knew what the message meant. All three men were gone within 30 seconds, absorbed into the surrounding darkness with the efficiency of people practiced at appearing and disappearing. Vivienne stood alone in the alley, the photographs in both hands, her heartbeat sharp and physical behind her ribs. She did not run. She did not call the police. 6 years of proximity to the Crane organization had taught her that the police were not the architecture for this kind of problem. She turned back toward Harrington Tower. 20 minutes later, she was outside Victor Crane's office on the top floor. Without knocking, she pushed the door open. She was not surprised to find him still there. He was seated in the dark, the only illumination coming from the street lights filtering through the glass, and a glass of whiskey sitting untouched on the desk, because Vivienne had cleaned these floors long enough to know that Victor Crane did not sleep before 6 in the morning. She walked directly to the desk and placed the 3 photographs on the surface between them. He looked at the first, the second, the third. She watched his hand tighten around the whiskey glass, the knuckles whitening. Then he set the glass down, very carefully, very slowly, with the deliberate care of someone who understands that if they move too quickly, something will break. He picked up the phone, dialed a single number, spoke 4 words, not coldly, not in anger, in something deeper and more permanent than both: protect the boy. Now, he ended the call, looked at Vivienne, and in a voice so calm it did not match his eyes at all, because his eyes were something else entirely. He told her that within the hour, no would of continuous protective coverage he would never be aware of, that no one would touch him. Vivienne stood and looked at him, and she saw something that 6 years of cleaning this building had never once shown her. Not the controlled fury of a collapsed deal, not the precise, managed anger of a subordinate's mistake. Something older, more primal, the kind of anger that ignites when someone threatens something a person has, for reasons they cannot yet articulate, even to themselves, decided to protect. Victor told her the Caruso network out of Chicago had been orchestrating the interpreter sabotage to capture the Coastal Bay casino contract for their own interests. When Vivienne had dismantled that operation in a single night, she had made herself a liability to people who resolved liabilities in a specific and non-negotiable way. He turned back to her. The dawn was beginning to outline him against the glass, a figure balanced between darkness and light, depending entirely on where she stood. He used her name for the first time. Not Miss Cole. Not the formal address he used in correspondence and meetings. Vivienne. In that voice, it sounded like something it hadn't sounded like before. "This is no longer a matter of business," he said. "This is a declaration." 1 week later, Harrington Tower looked the same from the street, but inside its marble corridors and reinforced glass, the structure of things had shifted in ways that did not appear on any organizational chart. Vivienne's office on the 45th floor was small, the kind of room that would have been overlooked by anyone not specifically looking for it, at the end of a corridor most senior staff never had reason to use. A desk, a swivel chair, a wide monitor, and a small brass nameplate outside the door, engraved with precision: Vivienne Cole, Special Liaison Director. She stood in the doorway and looked at it for a long moment the first time she arrived. Then she looked at her hands. The calluses were still there, the skin at the middle knuckles still cracked, and she thought, without being able to stop it, how strange it was, and how quietly enraging, and how almost funny, that the same hands could wring out a floor cloth at 3 in the morning and correspond with the largest investment conglomerate in Japan at 3 in the afternoon. The talent discovery program began without announcements, without fanfare, without any formal launch that anyone might feel the need to oversee or manage. Exactly as Vivienne had wanted, she met each person individually. Claudette first, then Roland, then Naomi, then 8 others whose abilities she had noted across 6 years of observing this building in its most unguarded hours. Every conversation took place in the basement staff break room, with 2 plastic cups of vending machine coffee, a place where no one from senior management had ever had reason to set foot. Claudette cried when Vivienne asked whether she'd like to cook again, not socially, but professionally, with the scope and resources her abilities deserved. The tears came before the words, and then both came at once. Roland sat quietly for almost a full minute when Vivienne asked if he'd be willing to take a look at the company's logistics and financial reconciliation system, just once, just to see. Then he said he'd been hoping someone would ask for 5 years. Naomi said only one sentence, in the quiet voice of someone who had trained themselves not to expect things. I didn't think anyone here knew I'd ever studied architecture. Gerald Ashby said nothing publicly. He continued attending meetings, taking his usual seat, wearing the same 3-piece suits. But Vivienne sensed his discomfort the way one senses old smoke clinging to a room long after the source is gone, invisible, unverifiable, entirely present. He never addressed her directly in meetings if he could avoid it, always directing questions or references to Elaine or Marcus instead, as if not naming her might make her less real. Vivienne was not troubled by this. 6 years had been an extensive education in the irrelevance of other people's refusal to see. Gerald was not dangerous. He was a man approaching the end of a career he understood, watching the terms of that career shift beneath him, without any formula for adjusting. That evening, close to 11 at night, Vivienne was still in her office, reviewing the technical harbor design specifications that Michiru's team had transmitted that afternoon. Her eyes were tired. Her mind was not, because 6 years of overnight working had recalibrated her body to function in the hours when the rest of the world was still. She didn't hear footsteps in the corridor. Victor Crane moved more quietly than anyone she had known, regardless of his height. When she looked up, he was already standing in the doorway, holding 2 paper cups from the vending machine at the end of the hall. Coffee that, she was entirely certain, he had never poured for another person in this building. He didn't speak. He placed 1 cup in front of her, kept one for himself, took the chair across from her desk, opened the folder he'd carried in, and began reading. Vivienne looked at him for a moment, then returned to her own document, and so they sat, facing each other across the small room at the end of the 45th floor corridor, reading, making notes, occasionally drinking their coffee, in a silence that was neither heavy nor tense. It was the silence of 2 people who had, without explicitly deciding to, become comfortable enough in each other's presence not to need to fill it. Vivienne realized, somewhere near midnight, that this was the first time in 6 years she had not been alone in this building after 11. Near 1 in the morning, Victor closed his folder, stood, and walked to the door. He stopped with one hand resting on the door frame, his back to her, and spoke without turning around. "You're not afraid of me." It was not a question, not quite a statement. It sat in the space between, the particular register of someone who has always been surrounded by fear and genuinely does not know what to do with its absence. Vivienne raised her eyes from the page. She looked at the broad back in the dark suit, the faint scar visible above his collar on the left side of his neck, and she answered in a voice so calm it was almost indifferent, though it wasn't. It was the voice of someone on whom life had, over a sustained period, used up all the conventional fears, and what remained was something steadier. "I spent 3 years sitting beside a hospital bed, watching my brother fight for his life every single day," she said. "I've walked home at 4 in the morning through streets that taxis refused to enter. I ate 1 meal a day for 8 months to cover medical costs." A pause. "You are not the most frightening thing I have encountered, Mr. Crane." Victor remained at the door, his back still turned, but his shoulders shifted, almost imperceptibly, a millimeter, perhaps less, the small but unmistakable shift of something solid developing its first crack. Then he turned his head, just a fraction, enough for the corridor light to reach one side of his face, and on lips that Vivienne had seen, in 6 years, hold only their usual precise, uninformative line. She saw something so small and so brief she might have missed it if she had looked away for even a second. A smile, not a performance, not a social response. Something smaller and more private than both. The kind that arrives without permission and disappears immediately. as though the person it belongs to is surprised by its existence. The first genuine crack in Victor Crane's composure, and she understood, with quiet certainty, that it would not close again. 2 weeks after that smile, on a heavy, grey afternoon when Manhattan looked like it had been painted behind frosted glass, Elaine Torrance knocked on Vivienne's office door, entered, closed it behind her, and sat in the chair across the desk without speaking for close to a full minute. Vivienne waited. 6 years had taught her that sometimes the most useful thing you could give a person was simply the room to find their first word. "My mother used to sit exactly where you're sitting," Elaine said at last. Her voice was controlled. Her eyes were not slightly reddened at the rims, the careful remnant of something wiped away in the lift. "Not this chair, not this office, a chair like this, in a building like this, at midnight. Cleaning offices, emptying bins." Vivienne set her pen down. She worked 3 jobs. Elaine continued, looking at the rain moving down the glass in parallel lines. Night cleaning in an office block on Fifth Avenue. Morning kitchen preparation at a diner near Penn Station. Afternoon laundry work in Hell's Kitchen. 4 hours of sleep a night, sometimes 3, sometimes 2, for 11 years, so I could attend law school, so I could sit at that desk. She gestured down the corridor toward her own office. "The afternoon I graduated." She couldn't attend the ceremony because she was on shift at the laundry and had no one to cover. A neighbor told me later she cried at home that evening. She never said a word about it to me. "Is she still alive?" Vivienne asked softly. Elaine shook her head. 5 years ago, lung cancer. She never smoked a day in her life, but 30 years of breathing cleaning solvents in enclosed rooms produces the same result. The silence between them was not cold. It had the particular warmth of recognition, the warmth that passes between 2 people who have walked, by different routes, the same dark road. "She lived long enough to see you succeed," Vivienne said. "She did," Elaine nodded. Then, very quietly, "She didn't live long enough to see a grandchild." Her voice caught. "I tried for years," Elaine said, her chin trembling. A movement Vivienne was quite certain no one else in the organization had ever been allowed to see. "My body wouldn't cooperate." "Elaine." "Last week," Elaine said, her voice now fully unsteady, unable to hold the composure she had brought into the room, "I met with a social worker. There's a little girl, 8 years old. She lost both parents in a fire in the Bronx 6 weeks ago. She's in temporary placement and needs a family." A pause. The rain continued. "I keep thinking about what my mother would tell me. And I know exactly what she'd say. She'd say, 'Elaine, I raised you alone with 3 jobs and nothing else. You can raise 1 child with love.'" Vivienne stood, walked around the desk, and put her arms around Elaine Torrance, the most precise and guarded person on the 45th floor. Elaine held on. They stood that way in the small room at the end of the corridor, with the rain on the glass and the city grey and unrelenting outside, while 2 women who had arrived at the same place through entirely different losses held each other without either of them needing to explain why. "Your mother would be proud," Vivienne said. "Do it, Elaine. That little girl needs exactly you." That afternoon, close to 6, when the floor had nearly emptied, Vivienne's phone vibrated. She looked at the screen. She smiled instantly, wide, warm, completely unguarded, a smile that no one at Harrington Tower had ever seen on her face. The smile of an older sister. She stepped into the corridor to take the call, unaware that Victor's office was only 3 doors away and that its door was open. "Hey, kid." Her voice was entirely different from the voice she used in meetings, softer and more natural, the voice of someone who has put down every professional weight and is simply present. I know, I'm eating properly." "Yes, fine. That's not entirely true. But dishonesty in service of love causes less damage than the alternative. Did you take your supplements today? What did the follow-up results say?" "That's wonderful, Noah. I'm so proud of you. You know that, don't you? I'm always proud of you." A soft laugh at something he said. "Yes, I promise I'll come on Saturday. I'll make that pasta. Yes, the one with truffles. The one Mum used to make on her good days. I remember the recipe." Her voice dropped at the end of that sentence. "I remember everything." One hand came up to press against the corner of her eye. "Love you, kid. Study hard." She ended the call, drew a long breath, put her smile back in place, turned and stopped. Victor Crane was standing in his office doorway, 10 feet away, a folder in hand and clearly on his way to the conference room. And from the way he was looking at her, she knew he had heard, not all of it. Enough. They faced each other across the empty corridor. Late afternoon light slanted through the western windows, throwing a band of gold across the marble floor between them. Victor spoke, quietly, with the same flat, emptied voice he had used that night in his office when she told him about Noah's illness, the voice of someone pressing emotion down to make room to listen. "He doesn't know," Victor said. "Any of it, the cleaning, this building, what you've done." "Not a question, no," Vivienne said. "And he won't. You'll keep that secret." The words left her mouth before she had weighed them, and they both heard what she had done. She had said you, not Mr. Crane, not Sir you. A word so small it shouldn't have done anything, and yet it moved the distance between them more substantially than any contract or catastrophe had managed. Victor did not correct her. He did not note the informality or reassert the professional register. He simply nodded once, slowly, and crossed the strip of afternoon light on the floor, passing her on his way to the conference room. As he passed, she caught the particular combination of dark coffee and sandalwood she had begun, without consciously deciding to associate with his presence. It stayed with her for the rest of that day, and a number of days that followed. And she understood. Lying awake in her Bronx flat at 3 in the morning, that one small word had altered something, and that neither of them was anywhere near ready to name what it was. 3 months moved through Harrington Tower, the way time moves when a person is occupied with living, rather than simply waiting for it to pass, faster, fuller, with less space for looking backward. On a Friday morning in early December, the main boardroom on the top floor looked nothing like it had the night 12 interpreters had failed. The oak doors stood wide open. The conference table was draped in white linen. Champagne rested in silver cooling stands. And the people in the room were not pale with desperation or rigid with fear. They were at ease with each other, laughing, shaking hands, filling glasses, because the Mitsuru deal was complete. $200 million. Signed, sealed, and formally entered. Harrington Enterprises had just stepped into the largest chapter of its operational history. On the main display, Mitsuru Kenji appeared from Tokyo in a light gray suit. But today he smiled from the beginning of the meeting, and when he spoke, the room quietened, not from fear, as it had that first night, but from respect. He said he wanted to make an announcement. The Mitsuru Group had decided, based on the success of the initial agreement and the standards of communication established throughout the process, to expand the project beyond Coastal Bay. The partnership would now extend up and down the entire eastern seaboard, Boston to Miami, and he wished to offer Miss Cole the formal position of Director of Communications for the expanded partnership program, if she was willing to accept it. Vivienne was standing at the far edge of the room, holding a champagne glass she had not yet sipped from. She felt every eye in the room find her, but this time it felt entirely different from the night she had stood in the doorway with a mop. There was no contempt, no shock, no condescension, only acknowledgement. The particular, uncomplicated acknowledgement of a room that has come to understand what it was looking at. But the announcement was not only for her. Elaine stood and invited Claudette, Roland, Naomi, and 8 others from the talent program to enter through the open oak doors. And as they came in, Vivienne saw Claudette's hands tremble, saw Roland standing straighter than she had ever seen him in the records room, saw Naomi smoothing her hair every few seconds because she was not yet certain where to put her hands in a room like this. Roland approached Vivienne last. He was carrying a small object she recognized immediately as handmade, a wooden plate, modest in size, shaped with the careful imprecision of something built by a person who believed that hand-made objects carried a kind of meaning that purchased ones could not replicate. On it were engraved the words, "For Vivienne Cole." who showed us that a person's worth does not live in the uniform they wear, but in the heart they carry beneath it. Vivienne took it with both hands. Her calloused fingers traced each carved letter. She did not cry. But Elaine, watching from across the room, saw her chin move, the smallest, most controlled tremor, and understood. Victor stood at the head of the table throughout. When the room had settled, he spoke. He announced that Harrington Enterprises would establish a family hardship foundation, funded from the profits of the Mitsuru project, to support families navigating severe medical and financial crisis. Vivienne would serve as its founding chair. She looked at him. He looked at her. In a room full of people, the moment between them lasted slightly longer than any business announcement required. No one noticed, except Elaine. Who always noticed, Vivienne said. With one condition. Gerald Ashby, who had learned over 3 months that whenever Vivienne Cole said condition, it was advisable to pay close attention, sat very still. The Foundation's first case must be the Harrington family. Not a prominent name in this building. Raymond Harrington, Night Security. 62 years old. 7 years of consecutive attendance without a single sick day. He is currently liquidating his late wife's jewelry and borrowing from informal lenders to fund surgery for his granddaughter, 5 years old, congenital cardiac condition. No one in this building has been aware of this because nobody asked. The silence that followed was the particular silence of people who have just been shown something they had failed to see. Victor said, agreed. No committee. No vote. No process. On the screen, Mitsuru Kenji removed his glasses. When he spoke, his voice carried something different from anything that had been in the room before. Not the register of an investor. The register of a man who had lived long enough to recognize something true when he encountered it. He said he wanted to share something. That when he first saw Miss Cole through that screen in a cleaning uniform, speaking Japanese with a precision that made his own legal team's document look clumsy, she had reminded him of his mother, a mathematician of considerable natural ability, capable of solving differential equations in her head faster than others could complete basic addition. After the war, when his family had nothing, she became a seamstress. 20 years at a machine, from before dawn until after dark, without complaint. She taught him that intelligence and dignity can make their home in places that other people would not think to look. And that seeing Miss Cole tonight had confirmed that his mother had been right. Vivienne smiled at the screen and thanked him, and meant it more than she could easily say. After the room cleared, after Claudette carried the last plate of food back toward the kitchen, after Roland held Vivienne's hand for so long she had to pat his arm before he released it, after Elaine gave her a brief, precise, entirely characteristic wink before disappearing into the lift, Victor stepped toward Vivienne, closer than the room's usual professional geometry required, close enough that she caught the familiar combination of dark coffee and sandalwood. He spoke very quietly, for only the two of them. The Caruso situation has been resolved. 4 words. No details, no elaboration. Vivienne did not ask. She had lived in this world long enough to understand what resolved meant in Victor Crane's vocabulary, and to know that asking for details was not something either of them needed. And she understood that her absence of horror at this was something she would continue to examine in quiet hours. How much 6 years inside this particular building had changed the geography of what she considered acceptable, and whether the part of herself she had gradually adjusted was a part she had needed to release in order to survive. 2 weeks after the signing, on a Tuesday that gave no indication of being different from any other Tuesday, Vivienne's phone rang while she was reviewing the harbor engineering specifications Mitsuru's office had sent over that morning. No's name was on the screen, but the voice that came through when she answered was not the relaxed, undergraduate voice of a younger brother, asking whether his sister would come on Saturday and make the truffle pasta. It was the clip, controlled voice of a second-year medical student standing in a pediatric ward in front of a situation he could not manage alone. He told her he needed her NYU hospital. Now there was a child, 6 years old. Japanese family arrived in New York 2 weeks earlier. The girl had a high fever, declining responsiveness, and symptoms consistent with a severe allergic reaction, but he couldn't confirm because the parents spoke no English. The hospital's interpreter team had no Japanese coverage that evening, and without accurate history he couldn't identify the causative agent. Then he paused and said he remembered being told, recently, that his sister could speak Japanese. Vivienne asked who had told him. He said Elaine Torrance. She'd called the hospital's pediatric desk earlier that week looking for Vivienne, and had spoken with Noah by coincidence. Had told him about the new role, and said there were a great many things she suspected he didn't know about his sister. He said he had so many questions. But not now. Now he needed her at the ward on the 7th floor. She told him 20 minutes. She arrived in 18, having run from the subway through 4 city blocks. Her hair had come loose from its clip. Her coat was half off one shoulder. She found Noah standing outside room 12, taller than she remembered. She always noticed that he'd grown, then adjusted, then noticed again the next time, in a white coat slightly too large at the shoulders, with the careful, pressed expression of someone managing both a medical problem and an emotional one simultaneously. She entered the room. The little girl was lying against her pillows, flushed and frightened, her eyes fixed on the ceiling with the wide, still gaze of a child who has found herself somewhere completely foreign. Her mother was gripping her daughter's hand on one side, her father standing on the other, speaking rapidly in Japanese that nobody in the room could follow. And on both their faces, Vivienne saw an expression she knew better than she wished to. The expression of a parent watching their child suffer while having no access to the language in which to help. She knelt beside the bed and spoke in Japanese, gently, introducing herself and telling the girl that she had come to help. The relief on the mother's face was immediate and total, the relief of someone who has been underwater and has just broken the surface. Over the next 40 minutes, Vivienne moved between the family and the medical team, building the child's complete allergy and medication history, identifying a penicillin-based antibiotic prescribed by a GP in Japan without knowledge of a prior systemic reaction, flagging the connection to Noah, who confirmed the presentation and immediately escalated to the attending physician to adjust the treatment protocol. When the child's temperature began to come down, when she drifted into the first real sleep she'd managed in hours, her mother watching her breathe with the particular, exhausted vigilance of a parent who is not yet ready to believe the worst is over, the father turned to Vivienne and bowed. He said thank you in Japanese, in a voice that was barely holding together. Vivienne stepped out into the corridor. Noah was waiting, back against the wall, hands in his coat pockets. He looked at her differently from the way she was used to being looked at by him. 8 languages, he said. Not a question. A fact he was holding up to examine. Elaine told me. And Colombia. Vivienne leaned against the opposite wall, the two of them facing each other across the corridor, the fluorescent light steady overhead, the ward gradually quietening around them. I want to know, No said, and his voice was trembling in a way she had not heard since he was a 15-year-old boy waiting outside a surgical preparation room. I want to know everything. Colombia, 8 languages. The cleaning work. Why you never told me. Vivienne closed her eyes for a moment. Then she told him. She told him about Colombia, about the graduate lecture halls, the research program offer, the professor who told her she was the most linguistically gifted student he'd taught in 20 years. She told him about the night she opened the hospital's first letter and sat on the floor of her dormitory bathroom for 3 hours before she stood up, washed her face, and picked up her phone to begin the process of dismantling the life she had built in order to save his. She told him about the leave of absence form, about selling the flat, the car, about the banks, the friends, the people in the Bronx she should never have needed, about the night she was hired for the overnight cleaning shift at Harrington Tower and told herself, very firmly, that it was temporary, and about the morning, 4 years in, that she realized she had stopped telling herself that. Not because she had given up, but because it had simply become her life. And her life was sufficient, because at the center of it, her brother was getting better. He said, "You did all of it for me." Not as a question, as the weight of a truth he was now holding in both hands and did not know what to do with. Tears moved down his face without ceremony, not sobbing, but the kind that simply overflow when a body can no longer contain what it's been asked to carry. Thin, continuous, running down the face of a 21-year-old man in a medical coat, standing in a hospital corridor he had committed his life to. He called her his sister and said that he would spend his entire life being worthy of what she had given him. Vivian stepped forward and placed both hands on his shoulders. She looked into his eyes, their mother's eyes, precisely, and spoke in the steadiest voice she could assemble in that particular moment. "You were always worthy," she said. "From the very first day you lay in a hospital bed and told me you were sorry for making things difficult. You were already more than worthy of anything I ever did." He held on to her, and she held him back, in the pediatric corridor of NYU Medical Center, while nurses moved past with the practiced, respectful discretion of people who have learned to recognize the moments that are not theirs. This was one of them. That evening, Vivienne returned to Harrington Tower, not for work, but because she needed, after the afternoon she had just navigated, a place to be still. And the only space that came to her was the boardroom on the top floor. The room where everything had started. She didn't turn on the lights. She walked through the open oak door, crossed the dark room, and stood at the floor, to ceiling glass wall, in the same spot where she had once stood with a supply trolley and a 6-year secret and worn rubber soles, and no expectation whatsoever of being seen. Manhattan glowed below her, precise and excessive and beautiful in the way that particular city always is in the early dark, before the night gets old. She heard the footsteps before she turned. She recognized them. Even quiet, the footsteps of the only person in the building who moved almost without sound. Victor stood beside her at the glass, not close enough to require acknowledgement, not far enough to suggest distance. The particular measured proximity the two of them had arrived at over 3 months, without ever explicitly deciding to. The silence lasted for a long time. Then Victor spoke, his voice lower than usual, low enough that it barely cleared the darkness around them. "My mother's name was Margaret," he said. Vivian did not turn. She kept her gaze forward, looking at the city below, and let the words arrive in their own time, because she had learned, over 6 years of being present in rooms where people forgot she existed, that when someone begins to say what they have never said before, the most respectful thing is simply to be still. Victor said she had taught piano. He said the voice he used, she could hear it, was not the voice he used in meetings. It was the voice of someone remembering a piece of music they haven't heard in a very long time. Before his father, she had run a small teaching studio in Brooklyn Heights. Her specialty was chopin. Students lined up for lessons with her, not because she was the most technically formal teacher in the borough, but because she understood something about the music that was difficult to articulate, that it was always underneath everything, about grief given a place to go. She met his father at a charity concert, and his father was, Victor said, skilled at making darkness look like light if you tilted the angle correctly. He paused. When his mother began to understand what world she had entered, it was already too late to leave it cleanly. His father never forbade the piano. He never had to. He simply, gradually, over years, through 100 small adjustments, made her life into a space that had no room for it. The kind of cage that has no bars. The kind where the person inside doesn't know they're trapped until they try to move freely and discover that they no longer remember how. Vivian closed her eyes. Margaret in Victor's story was not a stranger. She recognized her in Claudette, who had fled an abusive marriage and hidden in a kitchen that no one would think to look in. In Naomi, who had set aside her career to hold her family together. In herself, a woman with 8 languages in her and 6 years of elected silence. Victor said his mother had died when he was 19, officially of illness, but, quietly, with the precision of someone who has thought about it for 22 years, He had always believed that she had died of something else, that she had died because she stopped playing music, because the part of her that knew how to live had stopped having anywhere to go. Silence. Then he turned to look at her. In the reflected light of the city through the glass, his eyes were not the opaque, unreadable dark she was used to. There was something inside them, faint, small, the way a candle looks from the far end of a long corridor. Present, fragile, capable of going out. He said that she reminded him of his mother. Each word landed separately. He said them like someone confessing to something they have never said aloud, and are not entirely certain they should be saying now. He said it frightened him more than any enemy he had faced. Vivian turned to look at him. In the dark of the boardroom, with the city glowing behind the glass, Victor Crane's face was not the face of the director of the Crane organization. It was not the face of the man who had managed $200 million in a single evening. It was the face of a 19-year-old standing beside his mother's piano after the music stopped, holding a silver pocket watch because it was the only piece of her he had left. Vivienne said nothing. She simply reached out, slowly, carefully, and placed her hand over his, where it rested against the glass. Her hand was small against his. Her calloused fingers rested across knuckles that had signed things she preferred not to examine too directly. And he didn't pull away, no declarations, no promises, no bridge crossed too suddenly. Just two hands touching quietly in a dark room above a lit city. They stood that way until the light across the floor had moved to a different angle. And both of them understood, without naming it, without accelerating it, without being in any hurry at all, that something had shifted, quietly, without drama, the way dawn arrives, uninvited, inevitable, and absolutely unable to be reversed. 2 years after the night two hands touched in the dark above Manhattan, Vivian Cole stood on a stage in an auditorium in Philadelphia before 300 people. She wore a dark navy blazer that Elaine had helped her choose over a long lunch that turned into a genuinely enjoyable afternoon. Her shoes were good leather. She was still not entirely accustomed to them. Her feet remembered rubber soles more naturally. When the stage lights reached her eyes, she thought, briefly, of the fluorescent lights in the overnight corridors of Harrington Tower. The ones that, for 6 years, had only illuminated a woman and her trolley and the sound of wheels on marble. The charitable foundation she now chaired had supported more than 200 families in 2 years. Raymond Harrington's granddaughter had undergone successful cardiac surgery and was now in primary school. The talent discovery program had extended to 17 organizations along the eastern seaboard. Claudette now oversaw culinary operations across the entire Harrington building portfolio, with menace that had been noted by 2 food publications. Roland had restructured the logistics and financial reconciliation systems to generate more than $2 million in annual savings. Naomi was leading the interior architectural design team for the Coastal Bay complex in Atlantic City. Vivienne did not recite these figures from the stage. She told a story. The story of a cleaning operative pushing a supply trolley through marble corridors at midnight, who accidentally whispered Japanese through a half-open door, and what happened next. When she finished, a woman in the 5th row, silver-haired, perhaps 55, her voice slightly unsteady, raised her hand and asked, directly, wasn't she angry? Didn't 6 years of cleaning offices while holding 8 languages and a Columbia degree feel like a waste? Vivienne looked at the woman. She saw the real question clearly, not about Vivienne, but about the woman herself, about the years she had spent feeling unseen and wondering whether they could be recovered. She said she hadn't wasted anything. She said that 6 years of pushing a trolley through a building where nobody noticed her had given her humility, endurance, and an understanding of what mattered and what didn't, an understanding she could not have acquired any other way. That every hour in those corridors had taught her that her worth was not located in the clothes she wore or the title on her door, but in how she treated the people around her and what she was willing to sacrifice to do right by them. And if she regretted anything, it was only that it had taken her a long time to reclaim her voice. Though perhaps, she said, she had needed all of that silence. Because when she finally spoke, she had something worth saying. After the talk, a young woman, perhaps 22, ponytail, wrinkled jacket, canvas bag on one shoulder, approached shyly. Her name was Phoebe. She was studying education, she said. She worked at a laundry business during the day to pay her tuition fees. And she often felt invisible, as though the work she did in the daytime cancelled the value of what she was trying to become. Vivienne took Phoebe's hand, held it firmly, looked at her. She saw herself. 7 years earlier, tired, alone, hands roughened by chemicals, eyes aching from too little sleep, too little acknowledgement, too little of the evidence that what she was doing mattered. She told Phoebe that there was no job without value, only a society that had not yet learned to recognize the value of every job equally. That working in a laundry by day and pursuing a degree by night did not diminish her worth. It demonstrated that she possessed more determination than most people who had never been asked to fight for anything. And she told her never to forget that. Phoebe cried, thanked her, walked away. Vivienne watched her disappear through the auditorium doors and thought this is why I spoke up that night. Not for the contract, not for the $200 million. So that one day a girl named Phoebe could walk away from a conversation knowing she was not invisible. On the flight back to New York that evening, Vivienne sat by the window and watched the clouds below. Her phone buzzed, a message from Victor, asking whether she wanted to coordinate the Mitsuru Group's expansion into European markets, London, Paris, Berlin, and whether she could assemble a team. She smiled, typed back yes, but she'd need to bring her own people, because she knew several extremely capable individuals who were still waiting for the right moment. His reply arrived within 30 seconds. Hire whoever you think is right. Then, a second message. 4 words unconnected to business, to Hayashi, to Europe, to any of it. 4 words that Victor Crane, 2 years earlier, would have considered completely unnecessary and said to no one, "Let me know you're home." Vivienne looked at those 4 words for a moment. Then she smiled, not the smile of a director or a foundation chair or an 8-language Columbia graduate, the smile of a person who had walked through 6 years of darkness, carrying everything alone, and had found, quite unexpectedly, someone who wanted to know she had arrived safely. The next morning, walking along the 45th floor corridor of Harrington Tower, she passed a young man guiding a supply trolley in the direction of the East Wing offices. New rubber soles, grey uniform slightly too large at the shoulders, posture still slightly contracted from the unfamiliarity of overnight shifts, from the particular loneliness of being present in a building full of people who don't see you. Vivienne stopped. She greeted him by name. She had made a point of learning it. Asked how the job was going. Told him to come to her if there was anything he needed. Smiled as she continued down the corridor. She already knew she would ask him, in a few months, about his background, his ambitions, the abilities he was carrying around inside a grey uniform in a building where nobody had thought to ask. Because the most important lesson her life had taught her had not come from any lecture hall or boardroom. It had come from 6 years of being present without being seen. From learning that every person moving through the background of someone else's story has a story of their own, of equal weight and equal significance. That value does not reside in the chair a person sits in or the uniform they wear. It lives in the heart they carry and in the choices they are willing to make. That sometimes the bravest thing you can do is not to announce yourself in a crowded room, but to whisper quietly, at exactly the right moment, when no one expects you to have a voice. And that sometimes, just sometimes, a single whispered phrase in Japanese, from a woman standing in a corridor with a mop, can open a door that changes everything. And I mean everything. That is the story of Vivienne Cole, the woman with 8 languages and a cleaning trolley and 6 years of chosen silence. The woman who listened until listening became the most powerful thing she could possibly do. And now I want to hear yours. How did this story sit with you? Have you ever felt invisible, truly, completely unseen, in a place where you gave everything? Do you know someone whose abilities are hidden behind a role that doesn't reflect who they are. Share your thoughts in the comments. I read every one of them, and I genuinely want to hear what this brought up for you. Because every story deserves to be told, and every person deserves to be seen. If this story stayed with you, please like it, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you don't miss what we bring you next. I wish you and the people you love good health, genuine joy and peace in the days ahead. Until next time.